Tonight, we begin with a development that military analysts had feared, debated, and quietly wargamed for decades. A shift that unfolded not over years of careful diplomacy, but in a single generation's memory. A single generation that watched one empire collapse. A single generation that watched another rise from its ruins. A single generation that now stands at the edge of something nobody in Europe wanted to see again. What Vladimir Putin did across Ukraine crossed a line that Finland had hoped would hold. That the post-Cold War peace, however fragile, would survive his ambitions. And when that line broke, Finland did not hesitate. They responded with speed, with seriousness, and with something that shocked the entire Kremlin establishment. They joined NATO, and in doing so, they didn't just change their own fate, they changed the entire strategic map of Northern Europe. For 80 years now, there had been signals, not from NATO headquarters, not from Brussels briefing rooms, just signals, that Finland was preparing something that most European nations had never seriously considered. Finland has been peaceful, yes, but they have been methodical in their peacefulness. Their moves have followed a certain discipline, a doctrine, almost a philosophy. But what set off alarm bells in Moscow this decade was that the old arrangement went silent, the arrangement called Finnish neutrality, the quiet understanding, the careful dance. Experts who monitor European security know the indicators: the slow expansion of defense budgets, the deepening of military cooperation with Sweden and Norway, the quiet procurement of advanced weapon systems, the sudden acceleration of NATO compatibility exercises. All of that went quiet. Because it stopped being quiet preparation and became open, unapologetic readiness. And whenever a nation that has spent 80 years avoiding confrontation suddenly stops pretending it wants to avoid it, it means something fundamental has shifted. Finland wasn't just reacting to Ukraine. Finland was revealing something it had always known, that the forest had always been prepared for the wolf. Early in the analysis of Finland's military posture, defense researchers detected what they described as one of the most quietly formidable defensive architectures in the modern world, including infrastructure and doctrine that had not been discussed openly in over 5 decades. These are the kinds of preparations that a nation only maintains when they are signaling something very specific, that they have no intention of being easy to defeat, that they have planned for the worst, or that they have decided the cost of invasion will be catastrophic for any aggressor. Observers didn't know which category Finland fell into, or whether it fell into all 3 at once, but what they did know was that Finland was not neutral in the way Moscow had hoped. Finland was neutral in the way a loaded weapon sitting on a table is neutral. It wasn't pointed at anyone, but it was absolutely ready. And when a nation of 5.5 million people maintains a wartime reserve army of nearly 1 million troops, that is not neutrality. That is strategy wearing a very polite coat. The message delivered by Finland's entry into NATO in April 2023 was not normal. It was not routine. It was not symbolic. It was seismic. Defense official, after strategic briefing, described Finland's military capability as deeply entrenched, institutionally embedded in Finnish society, and perhaps, most importantly, genuinely battle-ready in ways that paper armies never are. But intimidation only works if the target hesitates. Finland did not. In fact, their entire national defense philosophy is one of the most sophisticated we have seen in any country of comparable size. Here is what we know. Within a matter of decades of the Cold War beginning, Finland had built a national defense structure so comprehensive that military planners in every major power quietly circled it on their maps as an anomaly. These weren't symbolic border guards. These were trained reservists, men and women who cycle through mandatory military service and refresher training, connected to command structures, equipped with modern weapons, and embedded in a landscape that Finland has spent generations turning into a military advantage. Tonight, analysts confirm that Finland's defense system is built across multiple interlocking layers, including a network of fortifications and bunker systems that had recently been quietly upgraded for what military experts believe was precisely this kind of moment in history. Finland prepared before Russia could recalculate. They built their fortifications into the terrain itself. They trained their civilian population as a strategic reserve. They embedded their command infrastructure underground in systems that were likely preparing to make any northern invasion a logistical nightmare. In other words, Finland targeted the assumptions of any potential aggressor, the assumption that a small nation could be overwhelmed quickly, the assumption that NATO membership was the only deterrent worth respecting, the assumption that geography alone would make Finland vulnerable. This is what makes Russia's strategic position so difficult to navigate. Finland's defense system wasn't just symbolic, it was operational. It represented the kind of layered resistance that could stop an armored advance cold if left to function as designed. And Finland, understanding that fully, built not with bluster, not recklessly, not impulsively, but with extraordinary strategic patience. They didn't build an army designed to invade. They didn't build a military meant to project power. They built one thing, the most expensive possible target in Europe. They built the kind of country that makes a general look at a map and quietly close the folder. And here is where the story becomes even more remarkable. Military historians now believe that Finland's entire post-World War II posture was designed to test the resolve and patience of any would-be aggressor after the lessons of the Winter War of 1939. Finland wanted to see whether the Soviet Union, and later Russia, would miscalculate again, but instead of waiting to be tested, Finland made itself the test. Finnish military leadership didn't simply hope for peace. They built a defense so deep, so layered, so culturally embedded that even allies were quietly astonished. You don't get that kind of institutional commitment easily, but Finland has it. Defense analysts, speaking with military journals under background conditions, described Finland's approach as total defense, a way to make every citizen, every forest road, every communications tower a piece of the defensive puzzle. Finland proved that they remained both credible and capable. Their preparations were not only logistically sound, they were psychologically calibrated so precisely that the message was received in Moscow without a single shot being fired. That element matters because it shows something critical about modern deterrence. It shows that Finland is not a passive participant in its own security. They are an active architect of regional stability. As reports continued coming in throughout years of open source research and military analysis, we learned more about the true scale of Finland's defensive infrastructure. The Finnish defense forces maintain a wartime strength approaching 280,000 troops with a reserve pool expanding toward 1 million trained personnel, forcing any planner to account for mass resistance rather than quick capitulation. Finnish engineers targeted the terrain itself, building fortifications into the lakeland and forest geography that had been hardened in the last several decades, specifically for this purpose. Finnish civil defense architecture, operating across the country, reportedly maintains shelter capacity for the majority of the urban population. Bunker systems used to protect Finnish civilians from any aerial or artillery campaign. This wasn't just good planning. This wasn't just prudent spending. This was national will made physical. This was deterrence made concrete. Literally. And deterrence made concrete is the one thing Russia has struggled to overcome since the Winter War of 1939. For every advance they have projected, Finland has countered with something that makes the mathematics of invasion deeply unfavorable. Remember, Stalin thought Finland would fall in 2 weeks. He thought the Red Army's sheer size would overwhelm Finnish resistance before winter set in. He thought the world would barely notice another small nation absorbed into the Soviet sphere. But tonight, the exact opposite legacy lives on. Finland held for over 3 months against the most powerful military force on Earth at that time. Finland inflicted casualty ratios that shocked Soviet commanders and embarrassed Moscow before the world. Finland's resistance became the foundational lesson in Finnish national identity, that preparation, terrain knowledge, and collective will can neutralize raw numerical advantage. What makes this moment so strategically significant and so geopolitically charged is that Russia's posture toward Finland has shifted at a time when Putin is under enormous internal and external pressure. Russian hardliners want territorial expansion and historical validation. Russian moderates want economic relief and an end to sanctions. The military establishment wants resources, respect, and a clear mission. The Russian public wants stability, security, and a narrative of strength. Putin is balancing these demands while managing a grinding, costly, and increasingly unpopular war in Ukraine. And when leaders in that position look at their maps, they look for easy wins. They look for targets that will break quickly. Finland is the opposite of that. Finland is where that kind of calculation goes to die. NATO's collective defense guarantee, now extended to cover Finland's 1,140-kilometer border with Russia, was designed to signal that the alliance is not willing to allow Northern Europe to become a zone of Russian coercion. Officials from Brussels to Washington said plainly that any Russian military action against Finland would trigger Article 5, the Mutual Defense Clause, and would be considered an attack on all 32 NATO member states. That is diplomatic language for, you will not just be fighting Finland, you will be fighting everyone. You don't usually hear that kind of unambiguous commitment from a multilateral alliance unless the stakes are considered genuinely existential. Finland's accession didn't just give Finland a guarantee. It gave the Arctic, the Baltic Sea, and northern NATO a new strategic anchor. Meanwhile, Finland's leadership addressed the parliament and the people in a calm, deliberate, and deeply serious posture. They said, "We do not seek conflict with Russia, but we will defend every centimeter of Finnish soil." They said, "Our membership in NATO is not a provocation. It is a response to a world that changed when Russia chose war." And they said, "Finland has always been prepared. Now the world knows it. These are not rhetorical flourishes. These are statements from a nation that has spent 80 years preparing for a moment it hoped would never come, and made sure that if it did, the outcome would not be in doubt. Here is what makes the broader situation even more concerning. Russia's pressure on Finland was not isolated. Along with military posturing on the Finnish border, Russian aircraft also increased provocative flights near Finnish airspace in the months surrounding NATO. Accession Russian state media launched aggressive disinformation campaigns targeting Finnish public opinion. Russian officials increased threatening rhetoric targeting Finland specifically, warning of consequences for NATO membership. All of this happened within the same compressed window of geopolitical time. When Russia moves multiple instruments of pressure simultaneously, it means something larger is underway. It means the Kremlin is not merely reacting, it is probing. Analysts are now considering several possibilities about Russia's long-term intentions toward Finland. One is that Russia is preparing a prolonged campaign of hybrid pressure, cyber attacks, disinformation, and economic interference, designed to make Finland's NATO membership feel more costly than comfortable. Another is that Russia is attempting to exploit any internal Finnish political divisions to slow defense cooperation and create hesitation within the alliance. A third possibility, the one worrying officials the most, is that Russia is attempting to establish a new northern threat axis, using its Murmansk region as a staging platform to pressure both Finland and Norway simultaneously. But today, Finland and NATO have taken key options off the table. They didn't leave the northern border unguarded. They didn't allow uncertainty about the defense commitment to fester. They didn't give Moscow the ambiguity it needed to act. They established clarity, they established presence, they established cost. What we are watching now is a test of institutional will. Russia wants to see whether NATO's commitment to Finland will fracture under sustained pressure. Finland wants to show that small nations with genuine resolve can deter great powers. NATO wants to prevent the normalization of Russian territorial aggression in Europe. And the broader democratic world wants to prevent the collapse of the rules-based international order. Tonight, we have heard from strategic analysts who are now monitoring the entire Northern European security corridor with renewed intensity. They say Finland's defense posture is being studied and, in some respects, emulated by other smaller NATO nations who see in Finland's model a template for serious, affordable, and credible deterrence. They say the 50,000-plus bunker and shelter infrastructure across Finland represents one of the most comprehensive civil defense systems in the democratic world. And they say Russia's decision to treat Finland's NATO membership as a strategic setback is likely part of a broader narrative intended to frame Moscow's failures as Western aggression rather than Russian miscalculation. But Finland is not waiting to be defined by Russian narrative. In fact, Finland is writing its own. Their response, methodical, serious, and deeply rooted in national identity, sent a message to Moscow that history is not repeating the way the Kremlin hoped. And it sent a message to the world that democratic nations can choose security without surrendering their character. As the broader European security situation continues to evolve, we expect more details to emerge about what exactly Russia hoped to achieve by making Europe feel unsafe. But what we do know is that Finland's transformation from neutral state to NATO's northern anchor was timely. It closed a strategic gap that Russia had long considered an opportunity. It extended NATO's border with Russia by more than 1,300 kilometers in a single decision. And it demonstrated that when democracies feel genuinely threatened, they do not simply appeal for protection, they build it. What happens next will depend on what Russia does in the coming years. If they recalibrate toward genuine diplomacy, this moment will be remembered as the turning point that stabilized Northern Europe without firing a shot. If they continue escalating, Finland and NATO have already shown they are prepared. They have shown they are ready to respond. And tonight, for the first time in decades, Russia appears to be staring at a northern border it cannot easily calculate. The Kremlin is quiet. Too quiet. And when the Kremlin is quiet about Finland, it means they are reassessing. It means they are choosing their next move very carefully. Because tonight, Russia learned something they have been reminded of before, but perhaps not clearly enough. That Finland is not a small country. It is a large trap. That preparation beats improvisation every single time. And that the forest remembers everything the Winter War taught it. This story is far from over. But tonight, one thing is absolutely clear. Finland chose its future and built it with its own hands. Russia's window for easy northern expansion has closed permanently, and 1 million trained Finnish soldiers, 50,000 fortified positions, and 32 NATO allies are making sure it stays closed. And we will be here, watching every detail, as the next phase of this extraordinary story unfolds.